Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second session today, Tourism Beyond a COVID-19 Recovery. If you weren't with us earlier on for what was a really insightful first session, I started by saying how thrilled I was to actually physically be on this stage today in what is the first major in-person international travel event since the outbreak of the pandemic. If I never had to do another Zoom moderation, it would be too soon. It is really, really good to be back. And although these sort of events I know will have a virtual layer going forward, and to a certain degree that's really useful, and I think is a great new sort of dynamic for international events. It is, and I'm sure you'll agree, really good to actually be back. And we talked about how in no small part us being here today is as a result of the exhaustive efforts in ensuring the safeguarding of public health by the leadership and authorities here in the UAE, without which we wouldn't be here today. Their vaccine rollout, of course, has been one of the fastest in the world, and it has ensured that we can not only be here, but also feeling safe. So I'm sure I speak for everyone in applauding those efforts. And we also, and I think it's important to just reiterate that, wanted to thank the organisers who have delivered, under trying circumstances, because things are changing, as we know, all the time. These headwinds of COVID-19 and the reimposition of restrictions around the world, make things extremely difficult. But in this tough environment, the organisers have really provided an impressive agenda and lineup of industry professionals from around the world. So, well done and thank you, and it's a pleasure to be involved. As I said, we discussed some really important topics in the last session. These significant headwinds do still exist. We talked about scenarios for a reopening and about the opportunities for a robust, sustainable recovery in the not too distant future. And we want to pursue those discussions with my esteemed guests on this panel today. His Excellency Dr. Ahmed bin Abdullah Belal Al Falasi is Minister of State for Entrepreneurship and Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises for the UAE, and in his position, his work is at the very heart of the strategy for tourism and business here in Dubai. So thank you for joining us, and we will have a short speech from His Excellency momentarily. We're also joined by His Excellency Mr. Zayed Al Zayani, Minister of Industry, Commerce and Tourism to the Kingdom of Bahrain. He's also Chairman of Bahrain Tourism and Exhibitions Authority. It's wonderful to have you with us as well. And Haytham Matta is newly installed in the past month, I think, Haytham, as Managing Director for IHG Hotels and Resorts, Middle East and India and the kind of wider region, a new and demanding role leading the operations and performance of more than 160 hotels, as well as overseeing, and this is really important, and I'll be fascinated to get his insight on this today, overseeing the strategic development of IHG's plans with a pipeline, as I understand it, of more than 100 hotels. So how that strategy is resilient in what are these difficult times will be a topic that I know we will discuss at length today. So we thank you for joining us. It's wonderful to be here, as I say, and I'm going to hand it over to His Excellency first for a short keynote speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It certainly is good to be here today at the first Arabian travel market post the onset of COVID-19. As Becky has mentioned, it's good to meet people in person. It's good to talk about the status of tourism globally. It's a highly volatile sector. It's a sector that depends primarily on certainty to be able to book your travel. It depends as well on safety. Nobody would travel unless they feel completely safety, as well as trust in the host country when you visit. So I think given the recent developments globally, tourism did in fact suffer the most, I would say, when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic. The UNWTO has revealed that last year, international tourist arrivals have dropped by 74%. This has led to a staggering $1.3 trillion drop in export revenues globally. That's more than 11 times the 2009 global financial crisis, just to give you the magnitude of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Quantifying the impact allows us to see the sheer scale of the damage that COVID-19 wreaked onto the sector, where up to 120 million jobs are still at risk. As a highly connected and globalized economy and a major tourist destination, the UAE too felt the impact of the global pandemic. But we are fortunate to have a dynamic government that was able to swiftly adapt and tackle the healthcare side of the pandemic while ensuring the economic continuity and sustainability of the sector. We opened our doors to visitors for the most part of 2020 and continued to operate international flights, implementing extensive healthcare measures. The UAE also launched its own nationwide tourism identity in 2020. We promoted the domestic tourism campaign. Some of you, I'm sure, are aware of it, the world's coolest winter. This ran 45 days from December through January, and it generated about $1 billion dirhams of revenue by focusing on domestic tourism. The Ministry of Economy was and remains committed to supporting the tourism sector, a key industry here in the UAE, representing over 12% of national GDP. These measures were instrumental in ensuring the industry's resilience in the midst of a global crisis. Statistics reveal that the UAE tourism sector was amongst the least affected in the region and the world. Hotel guest arrivals declines less than our benchmark countries, where occupancy rates in the UAE have reached 54.7% in 2020, whereas the global average was 37%. This comes second only to China. Having said that, we're not completely out of the woods yet. COVID-19 continues to hammer the tourism sector in 2021, as evidenced by initial data for January and February of this year. While the UAE once again performed comparatively well, there is still a lot of work to be done to fully bounce back. Looking back on 2020, on the measures that worked and those that haven't, we're able to outline a set of measures we believe to be critical as we collectively clock our way back out of the crisis. Tourism authorities around the world must do more to empower and develop domestic tourism. The subsector has proven to be essential, ensuring the resilience of tourism sectors in the face of volatile and uncertain conditions. Furthermore, collaboration between regional and international tourism markets is key. It allows us to open more travel corridors, facilitating travel and easing entry formalities. And last but not least, we must continuously support the private sector, a key partner in the tourism sector with a tremendous role to play as international markets recover and over the next couple of years. Ladies and gentlemen, I look forward to the deep discussions. I think Becky has managed to set up quite an extensive list of questions that I look forward to. And we have a good mix of government and private sector. We hope that we'll be able to portray not only what we have experienced, but what we project collectively to happen over the next year or two. We're very excited and looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Well, it's a wonderful setup for what is now our discussion. And so let's just pick up perhaps from the points that you just raised there. We get a sense from you of where we are at here. So let me turn my first question to the Minister from Bahrain. And just, if you will, briefly discuss from your perspective what the economic impact of the pandemic has been in terms of tourism and hospitality, and how you in Bahrain have adapted to what is this shifting paradigm.
Thank you, Becky. Good afternoon, everyone. First, if you allow me, I'd like to congratulate the government of the UAE on the remarkable efforts conducted during the pandemic. And I would like to congratulate Dubai, especially, for hosting us today. It's certainly a pleasure to be back in a venue rather than facing a screen, and to engage with people at close proximity, and to look someone into their eyes when you're speaking to them rather than a screen. So well done. Dubai, you've always been a leader, and once again, you're taking the forefront in this. We wish you all the best. I have been fortunate or unfortunate, depends how you look at it, but as a Minister of Tourism, I'm also the chairman of Gulf Air, our national carrier. I was put to face the worst two sectors that suffered from the pandemic. We had to deal with the airline or the aviation issue, and a lot of it was really out of our hands because we were bound to whatever countries were still open. We're very grateful to the leadership in Bahrain for keeping us going and giving us the mandate to stay open. Throughout the pandemic, Gulf Air continued to operate. Our airport was fully functional for every day in 2020 and continues to do so. In the end of January this year, we opened our new terminal at Bahrain International Airport, boosting the capacity threefold. So we're now up to 15 million passengers capacity. And we've done all that at a time when airlines or countries were shy to fly, passengers were reluctant to take the risk. And like His Excellency the Minister mentioned in his speech, uncertainty was probably at the highest levels we've witnessed in our lifetime. On the other hand, of course, we have tourism in Bahrain that is highly dependent on traffic we get from the causeway with Saudi Arabia. That too was restricted with movement. So we had, so to speak, a double whammy. We lost the air travel, we lost the land connectivity to Saudi Arabia. Today we are looking at better days. We are gradually reopening up our network on the aviation side. And when I say network, I don't only mean destinations, I mean frequencies. Just to give you a simple number, prior to the pandemic, we used to fly 7 times a day to Dubai and 9 times over the weekend. That went to 0. It came back with 1 flight. We're back now to 3 flights a day and 5 flights on the weekend. And we're also opening up other destinations and gradually building the network. We're also seeing other airlines coming back to Bahrain from the region and beyond. So that's picking up. And tomorrow, hopefully, we will have the Saudi causeway opening up again for traffic from Saudi. So we look forward to welcoming our brothers and sisters from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia back to Bahrain. The government in Bahrain, I think one of the things we did well is that we took on the pandemic very early. Our first official dialogue about it was on the 23rd of January 2020. Well before it was, a global issue. We started talking about it seriously, formally. We formed a task force early February, and that task force, led by His Highness the Crown Prince, the Prime Minister, was meeting twice a week regularly before we had a single case in Bahrain. That gave us more of a breathing space. Initially, the focus was how to secure medical aspects, including food security. As you know, most of the Gulf states rely on importing food, so we had to make sure that the logistic lines and the supply lines were intact. And gradually, towards May, we started looking at the economic fallouts of the pandemic. We realized that one day the pandemic will be history, but the economic fallout will resonate with us for a few years to come. So gradually the shift started to go from medical to economical, not losing sight of medical, of course. We always ensured that we had enough capacity in our medical system, enough staff, enough equipment, enough medication, and that continues to be the case today. But we started looking at how to keep the economy in survival mode. We weren't looking for growth, because it's unrealistic to look at growth, but we were looking at preservation of what we have. And we launched the first economic stimulus package in March last year, and we purposely front-loaded it heavily to make sure that we preserve as many jobs as we can in the local businesses. That was about 33% of the GDP of Bahrain. That has helped to stabilize the job market, because we didn't want to add another social problem to the pandemic of people getting fired and not being able to, secure their livelihoods and take care of their families. That worked well. We carried on then with 3 more stimulus packages on a diluted basis, looking at the most affected sectors, and certainly tourism was one of them. We carried that for a full year till the end of the first quarter of 2021, supporting the tourism sector in Bahrain. It was one of the last sectors that enjoyed support. And today, from the beginning of Eid, all economic sectors have been reopened in Bahrain. We are confident that, in a month or two, we'll be reaching a comfortable level, because as we speak today, about 60% of the population has been vaccinated. Add to that people who had COVID and recovered, so we're looking at 75% of the population who, so to speak, are in a safer zone. Like the minister said, we're not out of the woods yet. We shouldn't let our guard down. We shouldn't take the vaccination to be 100% immunity, but we should always have some hope and optimism, because we can't just look at the past and give up. One of the good news we have, for example, in Bahrain, this week we have 3 hotels opening up, adding another about 600, 700 rooms to the supply of hotels in Bahrain. We have seen the private sector not totally discouraged from investing in this sector. We at Gulf Air continue to carry on with the delivery or receipt of our airplanes from Boeing and Airbus. And we think by the end of this year, the picture will be clearer. We've started seeing recovery numbers in our economy, as well as in our tourism sector. So I think the worst is probably behind us, but we have to be very cautious going into the next 3 months. I think this is probably the most critical 3 months in the pandemic.
And I think the world understands that we are only as strong as its weakest link, right? And so,
Absolutely.
Whatever economies are doing here, and whatever the private sector is encouraged to do, and we'll talk to Haytham now about sort of confidence from the private sector investment strategy. At the end of the day, until everybody is sort of looking towards herd immunity, I think, let's be quite honest, getting the sector back to pre-pandemic levels is some distance down the road. But what is achieved between now and then is what is really important. Haytham, just talk about, you're new into a job whose portfolio includes India and its environs. So clearly, the COVID wave there, which has really worried so many people around the world, will have been of significant concern to you. Just talk about the impact, briefly, if you will, on your business. But how have your investment strategies as a group changed, if at all?
Great. So look, first of all, our hearts and thoughts go with the people of India during these very difficult times. And IHG has acted very responsibly towards supporting our team members and our owners to protect the business and protect our team members across India. The way that IHG has responded to the pandemic has been exemplary in my mind. Being on the outside and now being in the inside on my 4th week into the business. And we've seen the industry come to its knees. It's probably the first time ever that we've seen this sort of an impact on the private sector and the industry. Most of our owners are individual owners that own small hotels, so it's small businesses. Hence, the impact is much larger on these individuals, especially in India as well, where we have a number of smaller hotels owned by individuals. The shift you see today in investment, to answer your question, Becky, is we're seeing owners who are looking at lower cost investments, yet a efficient performance, and also sort of mirrors the paradigm shift in the consumer behavior and the buying behavior. We're seeing, for example, today demand coming for the week, in the week, very short windows. So we've had to adapt our systems, our agility, our response. Obviously, we've had to take the same difficult decisions as every hotel operator has in reducing staff members, sending people on furloughs, reduced salaries. And yet you see this spike in demand during holidays or during weekends. So we'd have to be very ready for that. Now, in terms of in the behaviors of the consumers or our travelers, cleanliness has become critical. So that, again, on the investment side, whether you're building a new hotel, how do you incorporate that in ensuring that you mirror what the airlines are doing and what the airports are doing in terms of contactless experiences, right? Today they say you don't have to travel with a passport anymore in the near future, right? It's going to be all facial recognition. Airlines are saying you don't need a boarding pass anymore. It's going to be, again, facial recognition. So how does the hospitality industry make sure that we have, as IHG is capitalizing on its digital advantage, and we make sure that we continue with that digital journey and ensure that our investment goes toward safe, clean stays as well as your digital advantage?
No, that's fascinating. It's something we talked about in the previous session. So thank you for bringing it up. Excellency, Your Excellency, I want to talk to you about collaboration between public and private stakeholders and indeed investments. Can you give us some concrete examples of how you are collaborating with the hospitality industry as a government, and the sort of decisions you are making? I'm thinking about remote visas, for example, about things that have sort of emerged through what we have been through, the digital nomad, for example, how these are all going to play a role in your bounce back from this. I think there's a lot of really interesting things that are going on here in the UAE with these sort of collaborations, with new legislation that will provide, I know to your mind this is a will rather than a hope, will provide a more robust, sustainable future for this industry and the economy going forward.
Absolutely. So I think here in the UAE, we've been fortunate that the tourism mix worked to our advantage. One, very well diversified sets of international travelers. So as you know, each country goes through different waves, and we're able to weather that. Secondly, when it comes to tourism, about 79% is leisure and 21% is business. And as you know, business was the most affected. Leisure continued to continue. And as we project going forward, as you mentioned, with the onset of online meetings and the economic recession, we expect business travel to take a longer curve to pick up. So we're trying as much as we can to work with private sector to adjust for that. So for example, during the peak times between December until March, when restrictions eased up, but there was still a shortage in travelers, we refocused on domestic tourism. So the private sector was mostly focused on international tourists. We remained open, yet host countries were still not, or source markets were not fully opened. So we worked together on a private-public partnership for a nationwide campaign where we were able for 45 days promote all of the Emirates. We've increased the hotel occupancy. There was about 1 billion dirhams of revenue in 45 days. We were able to really portray the offerings for the local residents and the citizens. And that, I think, continued on. So the tailgate of that in February, we still had 25% increase in domestic tourism. So as UAE government, when it comes to public and private, we saw that we were exposed when it comes to international tourists. So to put things into perspective, the global average has about 70% domestic and 30% international. The UAE is exactly the opposite. So with the pandemic, you really are exposed. That's one area. The second area was on digital marketing. We had a tourism app where we worked with tourism offerings to have them on the app and make it available for domestic tourists. And thirdly, it's also about negotiating. So as we negotiate on opening travel corridors, we consult with the private sector to see which markets are worth fighting for. And based on that, we try our best to establish safety corridors. We've announced the one with Greece, the one with Bahrain, upcoming one with Serbia. So we follow as well the demand from the private sector. Yeah.
Let's come back to
Sure.
the idea of people as a new concept, as it were, these remote working visas, the opportunity that has been provided through lockdowns, as it were, for people to reconsider where they may work going forward and what that might provide as an opportunity going forward. Your Excellency, we've just discussed the opportunities that the UAE has seen in relationships, bilateral relationships, for example, with Greece and Bahrain, opening up the corridors. I wonder, where do you see those opportunities? I mean, you know, we should talk in principle about the notion of opportunities that also build bridges. I mean, I don't want to ignore the fact that the Abraham Accords were signed between the UAE and Bahrain last year, a huge success with bipartisan support from the US at the time. Now we are holding this panel today against a backdrop of some really concerning escalation in the conflict between Israel and Gaza, and indeed, of course, between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs on the streets. This is, I'm sure, of serious concern to you. The idea, though, of the Abraham Accords on a long-term basis was about building bridges and ensuring a peaceful existence for both Palestinians and Israelis going forward. So just talk me through where you see these opportunities.
Well, first of all, the government of Bahrain is very clear about condemning violence anywhere and in any form. And we are a true believer, led by His Majesty King Hamad, that the best way of dealing with others is through tolerance and dialogue. This is the long-term vision. Whatever you have on the way there and short-term blips, we should, address fairly, equitably, but we shouldn't lose sight of the ultimate goal. And this was the driving force behind being part of the Abraham Accord with the UAE and Israel, is that we have to look forward to the next generation and the generation afterwards. This, of course, has no discourse to the Palestinians. They are a vital element of the equation. They're a genuine stakeholder. And Bahrain, and I'm sure the UAE as well, will never lose sight of the prosperity of the Palestinian people or their rights. We continue to hope that things are addressed in a calm manner, in a fair and equitable manner. In terms of accessibility and in terms of connectivity, it is important to keep the dialogue going, to keep the talks going, until we reach a place where it is feasible and doable for all parties concerned. More specifically on the travel side, yes, we have engaged. I mean, Bahrain is unfortunate in the sense that we don't have the geographical mass or population to develop a sustainable local tourism scene. So we have to rely on people coming from abroad. Saudi has been very successful in promoting internal tourism because they have different regions, they have a huge area, huge population, excellent infrastructure, and a magnificent product to support that. In Bahrain, unfortunately, we don't have those liberties. So we looked at things of how to stay connected to the world, if we look at Gulf Air, we were one of the first airlines to join the IATA Passport initiative, and we've already engaged that. This will lead to what you mentioned in paperless travel, so even your passport, your boarding pass, everything will be on that app. You don't have to exchange any documentation. We've looked at easing e-visas. Today we have more than 200 countries that are on e-visas. And we're looking at safe corridors with the UAE, with Greece, with Singapore, Cyprus. These are already done. Israel as well, whereby people travel easily and comfortably. We have to not discount the value of comfort. People want to feel safe and want to feel secure when they travel. So that's been done. We've done as many as small initiatives. Even Gulf Air has launched an insurance package for free. When you buy your ticket, that covers you in case you get COVID, for all your treatment, repatriation, going back to your country, all that. We're trying to make the travel process as comfortable and as safe as possible to gain back the consumer confidence, people to get on planes and fly. Actually, when you're on an aircraft, you're much safer than being in an office space because the air is circulated much more frequently than in an office space. So the chances of catching COVID on a plane are much less than being confined in an office space or a closed room. People probably don't understand that
I think
yet.
we've all become experts actually, in things like that over the last year. Yeah.
But going through the process of travel,
Yeah.
through the airport, booking a hotel, when you're in another destination, going to have a meal or shopping or whatever, you need to be comforted with that as well.
Aidan, we've been talking about the potential for a bounce back, and then whether that will be a resilient, robust bounce back. And we talked about how the phenomenon of domestic tourism has been a real benefit to the UAE. Our friend from the minister from Bahrain talking about how they don't have that as big an opportunity there. I just wonder how the evolution of this recovery will affect an organisation like your own. Be that we see more, perhaps we will see more domestic tourism. Will we see more leisure tourism back quicker than we will see business tourism? And do we see short haul back quicker than we see long haul? I think we all agree that's probably the way that things will go. How does that affect a business like yours? And what's the pivot on strategy, if at all?
So two things. I'm going to put on my government hat for a minute, right? Given that I was in
Sure.
government just 4 weeks ago with the Saudi tourism. And the amount of work that the Saudi Tourism Authority and the ministry have done together in promoting the country and reminding Saudis about Saudi, right? And whilst Saudis love travel, Saudis spend over $22 billion a year traveling outside Saudi. And during a lockdown and an ease on travel within Saudi, it allowed us at the time to expose some of the rural areas in Saudi and the mountainous areas like Abha and Asir and some of the areas where there's a heavy culture like Rijal Alma and on the beaches of Saudi and down in Umluj and Jazan, who posed great opportunities not only in the summer but also in the winter, right? Domestic travel continued to fuel hotel occupancies. We've seen a great pickup, especially during holidays and the weekends. And Intercontinental has a history of firsts, right? We were the first 5-star hotel to open in Phoenicia, Lebanon in 1960, in Dubai in 1975, in Riyadh and Taif in 1975 and 76. So there's trusted brands. And we managed to work very close with the private sector in building these domestic packages. So with the staycations, with gearing towards family, focusing on safety, on health, and well-being for travelers, right? And the domestic tourism we're seeing now talk globally for IHG, right? Greater China is seeing great pickup in tier 2, 3, and 4 cities. I've talked about Saudi, that great pickup. In the UAE here, our hotels, Intercontinental Fujairah remains to be in great demand, especially during weekends and holidays. across the UAE, great demand during the past long weekend and Eid holidays. And we've seen that paradigm shift, right? As His Excellency was mentioning, the 71% domestic now it has shifted from the international market. And until we see not just vaccinations, but until we see vaccinations spread globally at a scale, until we move away from just the corridors and the green zones to a normalized global travel and access, that's when we will start to see probably a rise in demand and recovery pre-pandemic. When you look at some of the consultants like McKinsey and BCG, even early in the stages of the pandemic, right, and the lockdowns, they forecasted a 2019 baseline recovery in 23 and 24, right? Late 23, early 24. This is about a year ago. And it still stands. If you look today, we saw earlier from the gentleman from Oxford, he was saying recovery is going to be 23 for the business travel and leisure end of 22. So it still resonates with what we've seen in terms of recovery for the region. Domestic in countries like Saudi, which is very populous, Egypt as well, very populous, and diverse landscapes, that allows countries to rely on the domestic. However, domestic cannot be the bread and butter for the hospitality industry in the long run, because obviously we've got hotels that operate 365 days a year, so weekend and holidays is certainly not enough business to keep our operations running at efficient as we want them to be.
Fascinating. Minister, the UAE has ambitious plans to double its economy by 2031. And in typical sort of UAE fashion, in the midst of a pandemic, it announced these plans and its strategy to hit those targets. Tourism and certainly your wider portfolio, that is small to medium-sized enterprises, will play a significant role in the success or failure of those plans. So we talked a little earlier, and I want you to expand on just the thinking behind the scenes and the responsibility and goals that you have been given now to ensure that your portfolio, your file, speaks successfully to that ambitious plan.
It is indeed very, very ambitious. The plan's very ambitious indeed. But I think, look, there's a lot of potential. So when we spoke about domestic tourism means different things to different stakeholders. So for government, usually we prefer international travel, because that travel would come on a plane, typically. For a hotel, they would actually like domestic tourists more than international, because they're more likely to be direct booking, and therefore a higher margin. So simply by us focusing on domestic tourism, we believe that we can actually increase the value of the impact on the economy much higher, giving this untapped potential. We're predominantly focused international. So that's one area that we can really develop. As you mentioned before, we talked about the remote work visa. Simply by allowing for that, we've seen a huge impact in terms of secondary homes in the UAE.
Have you? I mean, you've really seen that already, have
Yes,
you?
so for example, in March, it was the first time in 4 years where we exceeded our historical high in March of 2017. So we've seen a number of secondary homes being sold, so that was an immediate uplift in real estate. When it comes to entrepreneurship, my other hat, we've seen an increase in overall venture capital coming into the UAE, even within 2020. So yes, there's economic recession, but within tourism, if you look at domestic tourism, within the economy, if you look at startups and venture capital, there's still some untapped potential where it can actually really unlock value.
I see these numbers, and it's fascinating to look at the emergence of remote working visas and the golden visas and the narrative around that. And I see the actual substantive numbers that support those initiatives being good ideas. I wonder whether you have concerns that some of the sort of momentum that we've seen may have been as a result of the pandemic, and whether you have concerns that the UAE's opportunity to actually provide a more sustainable economy going forward as a result of sort of the incoming opportunities. can be sustained post-pandemic. And I think about myself, you know, I've lived in the UAE for 8-9 years now. You know, do I look to myself, do I consider a future in the UAE perhaps more now than ever before? Yes, I do. Is that because I've looked at other places, including my home country of the UK, and said, has the COVID pandemic revealed some fractures in what was, you know, otherwise a very, you know, substantive economy? Yes, it has. So, you know, from my own perspective, I see the opportunities here. I wonder whether you worry that when things eventually get back to normal, if indeed they do, and we will say that, whether you think you might lose some momentum there.
So let me give you some anecdotal evidence from my meetings with private sector, because I like to meet with private sector as much as I can. So one of the most difficult meetings I had was back in October, and back then the feedback I got was, you know, governments globally, they pitched in a bit more. You talk about paycheck protection, other mechanisms, whereas the UAE offered, you know, fee waiver and so forth. And they were expecting more. Then in my second meeting about in December, January, it was early January, after the new year, the conversation changed tremendously. They were actually extremely thankful that the UAE government allowed them to maintain operations and allowed them to continue with varying restriction levels depending on the healthcare situation, but that to them was much more valuable than being in lockdown and being offered a subsidy. So I think the confidence that was gained during the economic recession for businesses with the business continuity, as well as residents. So I think as a resident, being in the UAE, having access to 4 vaccinations, we're now at 72% of all eligible above 16-year-olds being vaccinated. The amount of testing, 200,000 tests a day, that's about 5 million a month. That's half the population a month being tested. So I think these impressions will give residents as well as investors a look into how would this government react during a recession, because when things are comfortable, it's good, it's very easy to sell your offering as a government in terms of the ecosystem, the ease of doing business and so forth. But I think businesses today are more worried about what if things go bad? How does this government react? How fast is it reacting? And how confident are we that our business will sustain? So I think both from residents as well as businesses and investors, there's growing comfort. And this is not a one, this is a lasting impression. Everybody suffered from COVID-19. I think 5 years from now, universities worldwide will be teaching each government and how did they respond. And I think Dubai would be one of those governments that would really shine in the way that we have reacted to the situation.
That's tees up very nicely, Excellency, for my next question, which is, where do you see us 5 years from now?
Tell me where we'll be in 5 months from now, and I'll tell you. Well, I'm hopeful that, you know, in 5 years' time, we will tell our kids stories about a pandemic that was 5 years ago. I think, like I said, we are very optimistic today, even given, and we must admit there's a lot more we know today than we knew last year this time. Although the numbers may look bigger today and the impact is bigger on the economy, but at least there's more visibility and more insight on what we're dealing with. Last time this year, we're probably fighting something that we didn't know much about.
Sure, absolutely.
And it was, a lot of it was, you know, trial and error based, first attempt. Today we have much more significant database to work with. We have shared experiences with other countries. And the world has worked, for once at least, collectively. Because certainly in my lifetime, this is the first time where I've lived something that impacted the whole globe at the same time with the same severity and the same degree. We've been through economic recessions, but they're usually in Asia, but you know, Europe is doing fine, or we've been in a hunger situation in Africa, but you know, America is doing fine, but this time the whole world is facing it at the same time with the same severity. 5 years from now, I think we'll learn how, I'm hoping that we would have learned how to work collectively. I think there'll be a huge impact on the business sector in terms of less travel, And certainly, as a chairman of an airline, we look very closely at that, the mix of our business class versus economy class traveler, the destinations, the frequencies. I see a lot of the daily travelers substituting that for Zoom meetings or teleconferencing has certainly become a trend. And that will change the whole dynamics of the tourism industry as well, because it will have an impact on hotels, it will have an impact on logistics, transports, restaurants. The biggest thing that will change in 5 years, in my opinion, this has probably nothing to do with the COVID pandemic, is that we will see a shift from shopping malls to e-commerce. And the question is, what are we going to do with this real estate? And what are we going to do to keep these shops? And that's part of my portfolio and His Excellency's portfolio, is how to keep these small SMEs vibrant, rejuvenating, and staying in tune with the times. You don't want them to have missed the train, and they've invested in growing a business. It's grown to a certain level, but people have shifted to e-commerce and they're not ready for it, and they go away. I think that's going to be the next shift, and we've seen huge changes in Bahrain, I'm sure in the region and the rest of the world, people shifting more to e-commerce. When I joined government in 2014, when I used to talk about e-commerce and how we should be prepared for it, a lot of the people in the audience and members of the Chamber of Commerce would be sarcastic about it. And because in this part of the world, especially, real estate development has been core in our economies. And most of the real estate has been commercial, whether office space or retail space. And some of them were even cynical. Now, 5 years later, I hate to say I told you so. I didn't know COVID was coming, but it's a reality. Yeah. We see the younger generation and the older generations who never dealt with e-commerce. And we see people coming, knocking on our doors, telling us, help us to evolve into e-commerce, especially in the SME sector.
That's fascinating. Haytham, His Excellency talked about the fact that COVID has done nothing if not democratize the problem, as it were. You know, collectively, the world has had to get to grips with this. It is not working collectively yet. The UNWTO is calling for more collective action. And I think as we look towards these vaccine passports, and as we hope we don't see another wave, the likes of which we've just seen in the last 2 months, because let's remind ourselves, we've seen more cases in the last 2 months than we saw in the first 6 months of 2020. And as you rightly pointed out, we knew very little about what was going on at the time. But, you know, there is a sense that, you know, we need more action and quickly on collective action. But, you know, this has been the democratization of the issue, if nothing else. In your business, then, what is the roadmap 5 years from now?
So first I want to start by saying, look, the mind has a bias for negativity, right? We see a pandemic, we immediately go into negative thoughts and negative perceptions. But there's a positive spin. If you look at 2020, for example, IHG has signed 360 new hotels. That's about a hotel a day. Opened 280 new hotels globally. So we've added to our pipeline. We've got over 1,800 new hotels opening in the next 3 to 5 years. So it's some good news. People were still spending, still investing. And whilst we've made difficult decisions, we've also made some great decisions as well. And if we look at the roadmap for the next 3 to 5 years, the collaboration is critical between the private sector and the government sector. And most governments have supported the private sector tremendously with various stimulus plans. If you look at what the UAE has done in the stimulus plans, as well as Saudi and Bahrain, in providing the private sector support to keep them on their feet until they get out of this very difficult situation. We've seen some closures across the Middle East, Africa, and there is about 70% of the hotels that closed, but those are not permanent closures. Out of the 70%, I think we still have a remainder, about 5% only, that are closed, and a very small amount of hotels that actually went into a permanent closure. So the markets are recovering. In the next 5 years, we will see a more focus on, on the travel demand of travel. So they become much more specific on what they want, become much more focused on their well-being. So health and well-being concepts, such as our Six Senses, for example, brand, is already seeing great traction from investors, and pickup spas and well-being is going to be predominantly in great demand. But we'll see also a shift that we're seeing today that will continue, right? For tier 2, tier 3, and 4 cities, unurban locations, less about that, city breaks that I used to be a lover of, right? City breaks. I always wanted to go to London and walk the streets of London, but that also has shifted me in my demand for travel. And what do I seek today, right? So we're seeing beach resorts, you're seeing islands, Maldives. Earlier was talking about, the minister was talking about the demand. We're also seeing in our hotels in the Seychelles and the Mauritius, great pickup. The IHG's way of clean, right, has also been underpinned by our, clean promise. And what we have really emphasized on is the new protocols, if you like, and digitizing those protocols. Of course, working alongside it, we've contributed to the WTTC's global hospitality protocols in terms of cleanliness and safety. And all of our competitors have also followed, suit in actually, leading the way in supporting the government's actions on providing clean stays and providing health and safety and well-being across the line. Now, will short windows continues in terms of bookings in the next 3 to 5 years as travel restrictions relax? I don't think so. I think people will go back to planning ahead. And will, what we call today social distancing, which a term I don't like. We're social animals. I think it's more physical distancing than social distancing. We continue to socialize. And we will continue to socialize. Now, how does that physical distancing will remain? There are people who develop space issues through this pandemic, and these space issues may remain. So in the next 5 years, how do we see that impacting hotel designs and experiences? Will the new hotel designs already incorporate physical distancing, already incorporate more on the digital experiences? I want to order room service. Do I need to call somebody, or do I have an app and I do 3 clicks and somebody knocks on my door and I've got my food, right? And I want to book an experience in the city I'm in. Do I need to call somebody again, or is it a digital app that the hotel also provides? So we'll see more investment on digital. And we will see that across all brands. We will see travelers wanting to go to hotels that have brands they trust, because they know this is a brand I trust. I know they're going to deliver on the promise, and I know what I'm going to get at the end of the day. And they know brands invest more in terms of the digital as well as the hygiene and cleanliness, whether it's training or whether it's products. For example, IHG has combined its forces with Cleveland Clinic and on the cleaning and hygiene protocols. And I believe today the digital advantage with airlines, with airports, with hotels has to come together. You can't have a disconnect, where you travel seamlessly and suddenly you arrive at a hotel and you still need to sign a registration card. That has to go. We've just have to really realize that people want to have less interactions. I believe the big lobbies and group size inaugurations is probably going to be less. You'll see more of the solo traveler in the next 3 to 5 years, more of the young couples and small group friends traveling. And we've seen recently a huge pickup from the senior population who have been vaccinated. But also, if you look at the Middle East key feeder markets, UK, Germany, Russia, mostly seniors who are already in pension, and they've got those legacy pension plans that pay dividends, great dividends. So they want to spend that on experiencing the world and traveling the world. And this is where we'll continue to see that rise with the senior population traveling across borders, that they're vaccinated and they want to experience countries, and they're going to go on a revenge. They want to go out and experience and travel.
I love the fact that you're talking about we will see whoever it is, and you're talking about seniors here traveling, which is great because that's what we want to see again.
Absolutely.
We want to see people on the move again. This has been fascinating, a really, really good discussion. Thank you. I think pragmatic, and I wouldn't have expected anything less from my esteemed guests here. I mean, times are tough. We have discussed that this crisis is not over. Is it far from over? Perhaps we can be a little more optimistic today than we even were, I don't know, 3-4 weeks ago. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you. Good luck with everything that you are doing. Thank you to the audience here. Your second session at ATM live in person is complete, and we're delighted. Thank you.
Thank you.